Hi, everybody. I'm Allison Freyberg, and welcome to Lecture 12, Using Sources, otherwise known as Quote Burgers. Let's dive in. Okay, when you're using sources, which of these thoughts have crossed your mind? Number one, if I load my document with sources, I'll prove my point and my paper will be longer. Number two, long quotes and data tables will make my paper longer and more convincing, right? Because we're always looking at that page count. How about this one? Well, they said it better than I ever could, so I'll just quote it all. Or number four, the quote says everything I need. It proves my point. Which of these have you thought? I'm guessing it might be a little bit of all of them. At least these are the comments I hear most often. And we'll try to figure out how to get beyond this and get beyond those trouble spots that we hit when we're integrating sources. Here's my understanding of those trouble areas. I think we run into trouble when we use research simply to back up our points. Now, that might seem strange to hear because we are so used to hearing, hey, I need research to back up my point. How do I prove my point? Well, I find research. I find stuff that's out there that proves what I'm thinking and that backs up my point, and that's what I'm supposed to do, right? Well, actually, we're going to talk about that as being not an effective way to get research done. Second trouble area is quoting so much that your sources take over your paper. It's your paper. It's your research analysis. You're having a conversation with the sources that are out there, with the conversations that have come before you. But it's your analysis. And when we quote all the time, those sources are just taking over our paper and we're not very present. And number three would be not properly identifying whether an idea is yours or is from a source. Now, that is plagiarism, and we talked about it in the previous lecture. So I invite you to go back to the How to Avoid Plagiarism lecture. So why is using research to back up your point a limited way of thinking? Well, think about it. If you believe something, and then you go find a bunch of research that validates what you already believe, are you learning anything? Are you contributing to the debate that already exists? Are you moving the research forward? Are you making us see something we didn't already see? Or are you simply, quite frankly, validating what you already believe? I think it's that's I think it's about validation. And it doesn't really help anyone, most of all your audience. And that's you're trying to do a research analysis to convince others of something. And that's not going to do it. So I think this is a really limited way of thinking. And if the research has already been done that proves your point, well, why should we listen to what you have to say anyway? It's already been said. Send me the other people's articles. You haven't added anything to the analysis. Now, why is excessive quoting and use of long quotes? Come on, how many of you have used those big, long, chunky quotes because it makes your paper longer, right? I'm going to show you that it doesn't make your paper longer. Well, that's a writer that says, hey, they said it better than I ever could. You know what? Then why bother to write anything? What do you have to say about what the source wrote? How can you contribute to the conversation, to the idea, to what's being said about this concept? That's what's key in analytical writing. So if all you're doing is dumping big quotes in your papers, You're not adding anything. You're not even present in your paper. And there's all sorts of reasons why not properly identifying your sources leads to trouble. But in a real personal way, it leads you to trouble because you end up being responsible for ideas that you're not sure of, that aren't yours, and somehow you end up being in charge of them. So in this case, I have, oh, great idea. I'm going to ask Jesse to lead the project because Jesse just submitted this proposal that had all sorts of ideas in it that weren't Jesse's. But Jesse's supervisor thought, hey, Jesse's got great ideas here. So now Jesse's in an awful position of leading something that they aren't comfortable with. If you don't say whose idea it is, you are saying it's yours. Please go watch the How to Avoid Plagiarism lecture. Okay, so what does poor use of sources look like? Here's one sample. I call this the big block Godzilla quote, right? Where you put all this big chunky quote in and you hope it does all the work for you, right? And you say something like, according to Marquez, and then they tell you to indent the big quote, right? Blah, 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 words, 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 blah, 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 more words, more words, more words. And that's all the big Marquez quote. And then you might follow it up with Marquez shows how blah, blah, blah is true. Basically, Marquez shows how I'm right. Well, the writer here is invisible. The source, who's Marquez? The source isn't contextualized. It takes over the voice of the paper. You know what? Send me Marquez's article, because whoever wrote this isn't necessary. Sample 2, how about the big Godzilla chart or table? Hey, if there's one thing that can take up space in a paper, it's a big chart or table, right? Those are great. So we pop those in there and half a page is down. Well, it's the same problem with the big quote. The writer isn't present here. It's just a big chart. And you're asking the reader to figure out everything for themselves. That's hard. And the reader is not going to do that. The reader is just going to skip it and move on to the next proposal or report. You have to host your way through those charts. Show us what you want us to see. Identify the points. Talk about how the points were arrived at. That's your responsibility as a writer. And if you just dump a big chart in, it's not doing anything because you're not doing anything. Sample 3, not contextualizing the source. Okay, how about this? According to Marquez, and then the quote, it's a smaller quote, right? It's manageable. Words, 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 words. She continues by explaining that words, words, words. By this, Marquez means blah, blah, blah. So as a writer, I'm trying to explain what Marquez means. And then if we apply Marquez's concept of blah, blah to whatever I'm talking about, my ideas, my ideas, my ideas, we can go on. I'll tell you what's really good here. That's this part after the quote, where I'm trying to explain what Marquez means, and I'm trying to explain how Marquez's idea applies to what I want to talk about. That's pretty good. What's not good is there's no contextualization of the source. Who's Marquez? What's her field of expertise? What was Marquez's article about? What was her conclusion? What point of hers do you want to focus on? I have no idea who Marquez is. I haven't introduced her expertise at this point. Now, how many times have you written papers? And when you bring in a quote, you're bringing in a source, you just say, according to X, whoever that is, And then you have this nice quote that you like, and you plop that quote in. And we have no idea who the source is and what their expertise is and why we should even be listening to that source. That's your job to explain. Okay, here's number 4 of a poor use of source. This is not explaining the quote or the purpose it serves in your project. This is kind of the opposite problem to number 3. So here's what I wrote. Crisis leadership is at the forefront of management studies currently. Director of the Center of Innovation Leadership, Chela Marquez, writes extensively about leading in times of crisis and argues that flexibility is key. She explains, words, her quote. But then I just move on to the next paragraph. Another example, blah, blah, blah. Well, what's really good here is this part. I've explained who Marquez is and what her expertise is. She's a director for an innovation leadership center. Okay, great. I should be listening to her about leadership and innovation. And crisis leadership. And she's writing extensively about flexibility. I get a sense of who Marquez is and what her expertise is. Then we have the quote, but then I abandon Marquez. I'm like, wait, what does the quote mean? How is it relevant to what I'm researching and analyzing? How does her concept apply to what I'm talking about? I don't explain that here. Okay, Allison. So how are we supposed to bring research sources into our writing projects? I've just covered the 4 biggest weaknesses I think I see or have seen over the years. Fair enough. How should we bring in our sources? I think that using sources conversationally is the best metaphor to really rely on. We think about, we need to stop thinking about sources and start thinking about people who have ideas and theories and experiments that they've published, and that we are going to have a conversation with them. And then we're going to find a way to contribute to their thoughts and ideas and experiments. It's a different way of thinking about sources. And if you're taking an analytical writing course with me, you've been assigned writing analytically by Rosenwasser and Stephen, and they recommend 6 strategies to use as points of departure for using sources. If you're not taking a course with me and somehow you just found this lecture online, then I highly recommend the Rosenwasser and Stephen book. I've actually been using it since its first edition. I think it's a great book. I have nothing to do with it other than I've taught with it for many years and think it's really helpful. And so this is their conversational analogy for sources. You make them speak, you attend to the language of their sources, you supply ongoing analysis, you use the sources to ask questions, not just provide answers. You put sources in conversation with each other. And most of all, best of all, I believe, is you find your own role in that conversation. We talked about in one of the earliest lectures that analysis is a demonstration of understanding of the concepts and ideas that have come before you, and finding a way to contribute to that conversation. Well, if we approach sources conversationally, then we're going to be doing that. But I would like to introduce you in terms of how to have conversations with sources, a silly, but I think helpful analogy for using sources. And this is the Burger method for integrating sources. And it is meant with a slight giggle and smile behind it. But it will give you a visual, a way of introducing, integrating, explaining, and clarifying your use of sources. These are when you introduce, you integrate, you explain, and you clarify, you're building layers for your sources. And that's what's key here. Think of those layers. All right. Okay, here's a burger. This happens to be a lentil burger. I have a great lentil burger recipe. Email me or drop me a comment in drop me a comment in YouTube, and I will send you the burger recipe. But what do you notice about any kind of good burger, right? Someone comes over to your house and asks for a burger. Well, you don't take a patty off the grill and just, take the spatula and you don't just fling it at their head, right? What kind of host are you that does that? Well, every time you just drop big quotes or drop tables into your papers, that's what you're doing. You're flinging hot meat at your guests. Why would you do that? Think about layers. Think about a really good burger. Right? You got buns, you got pickles here, you got tomatoes, you got onions, you have the lentil patty, you have some lettuce. Oh, I know there's some sriracha mayo below that. And then you got the bottom bun, right? Layers. Same thing when you're introducing a source. First layer, introduce the topic being addressed. Second layer, introduce the source or the table subject and the parameters and the point. In other words, what's the article? What's the table? What are they talking about? What is their main point? Maybe not your point, but what's their main point? What's their article about? Now, you're going to be using a quote or a table or a chart of theirs. Introduce it. What is it about? It plays a part in their article, but it isn't the article. It's a piece of the article, a moment in the article. What is that moment about? Now it's time to, that's the patty, right? Now we get to the patty. That's step 4. That's where you're going to actually integrate the quotation, the data point, or you're going to drop in your table. But then we have more steps. Otherwise, you're just asking people to hold a patty with their hands. So step 5 is you have to explain what the quotation or data point means. Dumping a quote in, dumping a table in does nothing. They don't explain themselves. You have to explain what they mean. And then that final step is you have to explain your interest in that quotation or data point. And what is its connection to your point? And when you do that, you've built a burger that has layers. You've built a source burger that will make sense to your readers, that will clarify your point, that will help people understand how you're using the source and how it connects to your points. And you're creating a space for yourself to contribute to the conversation. What does it look like? Okay, so let's go through the steps. What I did here is I'm not even going to tell you what the article is about, because if I do this quote burger well, I will have explained the essence of the article and it'll make sense to you, and its connection to my point will make sense to you. So let's see if I can do my job. Here's the quote from Robert Reich in an article called The Art of Narrative. To win the heart and soul of their employees and stakeholders, leaders need to speak to the basic stories and themes that have defined and animated their constituents for decades, if not centuries. Now, if I just wrote, according to Reich, and dumped that quote in there and then carried on with my paper, I've done a terrible job of integrating that source. Let's build a burger. Step 1. Introduce the topic being addressed. So like, what am I talking about in my paper? Where am I in my paper, right? So I might write something like this. Motivating employees and others connected to organizations has long been an issue for leaders. Okay, step one. Let's do step two. Simple, just follow the steps, right? Step two asks me to introduce the source and their topic. So who's Reich? What's his expertise? What does the article he wrote talk about? Yeah. What would that look like? Okay. Former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich introduces the importance of narrative for leaders trying to influence their audiences. Oh, okay. That's his article. Oh, he's a former Secretary of Labor. Well, he works with a lot of leaders, right? Okay. Step three. That's where I'm setting up the quote. I'm trying to prepare the reader for the quote. What's the point within the article? What's the quote going to be about? Okay. That might look like this. Specifically, Reich focuses on the power held within key stories with which most of us are familiar. So I've narrowed in on an aspect of the article that's going to be useful for me in my analysis. Step four, that's the actual quote, right? So I need to integrate the relevant quotation. This is the quotation, but I need to integrate it, which means I can't just dump it in there. I have to integrate it. So I did it this way. To win the heart and soul of their employees and stakeholders, Reich contends, leaders need to speak to the basic stories and themes that have defined and animated their constituents for decades, if not centuries. Okay, so I haven't just dumped the quote, I've indicated that Reich is contending this. Okay. So step five, that's where I have to explain that quote, because quotes don't explain themselves. By the way, all this could be done with a data table as well, right? Or just a bunch of information, stuff from your source. You still need to build your burger around it. In this case, it's a quotation. So I need to explain it. Here's my attempt to do so. In other words, he recognizes that there are stories that have been handed down through centuries within cultures, and speaking to those stories can help organizational leaders be persuasive and convincing. I have explained the quote. Now, I know in your mind right now, you're thinking, wow, I'm just repeating myself a lot. It's so redundant. We'll do a little test at the end, and I'll show you how it is not repetitive. Step six, that's that bottom bun. That's where you have to explain your interest in the quotation. Why are you using this quote? What does it help you show? Well, here's what I wrote. This historical perspective of Reich's becomes relevant when the subject of technology leadership arises. We tend to think of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs as influential leaders based on the innovations they've brought to their fields, but perhaps part of their success lies within their use of these kinds of common historical stories within their communications. I'm explaining my point. And then, now we've done all six, so for those of you who like a little more visual explanation of this, here we go. There are all the steps, 1 to 6, and this is what they would, all we did was we wrote a sentence for each one. And we put our sentences together, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we have a quote burger. And if we look at it in a report or paper view, essay view, it looks like this. Now I want you to just close your eyes and listen to this, because I know you're thinking it's going to be really repetitive. But just listen to this. Motivating employees and others connected to organizations has long been an issue for leaders. Former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich introduces the importance of narrative for leaders trying to influence their audiences. Specifically, Reich focuses on the power within key stories with which most of us are familiar. To win the heart and soul of their employees and stakeholders, he contends, leaders need to speak to the basic stories and themes that have defined and animated their constituents for decades, if not centuries. In other words, Reich recognizes that there are stories that have been handed down through centuries within cultures, and speaking to them can help organizational leaders be persuasive and convincing. This historical perspective of Reich's becomes particularly relevant when the subject of technology leadership arises. We tend to think of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs as influential leaders based on the innovations they've brought to their fields, but perhaps part of their success lies within their use of the kinds of common historical stories within their communications. That is a quote burger. And look at how big that paragraph is. There's the quote in red. And I built a story around using that quote. I built a burger. I built a conversation. You can do this with your sources. Don't dump quotes and tables into your papers without building the layers that are necessary to help them make sense for readers. If you want to review your work, look at those 6 steps and try to figure out which ones you tend to leave out. Go look at an old paper or go look at a draft you're working on now. Do you leave out step 1, step 2, step 3? Most of you don't leave out step 4, but have you integrated your quote? What about step 5, where you're explaining your quote? Or step 6, where you explain its connection to your point? I'll tell you right now, if your paragraphs tend to start with quotations, you're leaving out steps 1, 2, and 3. If your paragraphs tend to end with quotations, you're leaving out steps 5 and 6. You need to build the whole burger. Now, people have come to me and said, well, how do you do step 4? How do you integrate the quotation? I'm used to just like dropping the sentence in there. Even if I'm not dropping a whole big quote in there, you just take the whole sentence, right? No, you integrate. And here are 8 ways to integrate the quotation. Same quote from Reich. You can integrate the quotation at the end of your sentence. So you might open with, Reich suggests that, blah, 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 blah. Number 2, you can integrate the quotation at the beginning of your sentence. So, quote, 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 suggests Reich. And these are in APA format, so you can see, get a little work on in-text citation there. Sometimes you can integrate the quotation into the middle of your sentence. So here, the red is my work to integrate. Reich suggests, quote, 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 because those are the stories that will resonate with them and speak to their convictions. Quote, or style number 4 is to integrate the quotation divided by your own words. Now, this is what I did for our sample, right? I said, so quote, quote, Reich suggests, and then finish off your quote. And here's 4 more ways. You can introduce with a colon. Reich explains succinctly what needs to be done. Colon. Boom. Quote. Very common form with a comma, according to Reich, comma, blah, blah, blah. Number 7, you can use that. So Reich argues that blah, 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 blah. Notice there's no comma here, right? Because the comma is not grammatically necessary there. Remember, you don't automatically use a comma when you're like before you start a quote. That's people just told you that because most of the time people were doing this according to so-and-so, comma. There you need a comma. By the way, lecture 18 is grammar time, so you can go have a look at that if you'd like to. We have a wonderful time with commas. And number 8, you can integrate the quotation by using as says or as suggests. Say, as Reich suggests. It's very much like the according to Reich. Okay, blah, 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 blah. Now, this is something you need to get handy with all these ways of integrating the actual quotation. It adds variety. It also adds style in the best sense of the word style, because look even at the beginning. Let's go back here to this one. If you integrate the quotation at the end of your sentence, that means it's kind of like what's at the beginning of your sentence is usually the most important. So I'm really trying to highlight that Reich said this. But in the second one, Reich is at the end. So I'm trying to foreground here the words of the quote more. So there's all these subtle differences with whichever way you're using this integrating a quotation with step 4. So get handy with it, practice it. It's like practicing scales on a musical instrument. You just have to practice it. All right, so here's our recap. Don't use sources uncritically simply to back up what you say. Don't quote excessively. Don't neglect to clarify whose ideas are whose. And strategies: do use sources conversationally. Do use the Burger method. I invite you to use this method. Over the years, students have come to me and said, wow, it just really helped. It really helped me push past difficult points in papers I was writing. When I got stuck, I just made a quote burger and I moved forward. And do integrate all your quotations. And that is integrating sources with quote burgers. I'll see you next time.